Delphine LaLaurie, born in 1787, was a popular New Orleans socialite of Creole background. Married 3 times, her neighbors were shocked to learn that she had tortured and abused enslaved men and women in her French Quarter home. Although she escaped and left the country, her home, LaLaurie Mansion, remains one of New Orleans' most famous structures. LaLaurie tortured and possibly murdered multiple enslaved persons at her French Quarter mansion. LaLaurie is one of New Orleans' most notorious women. The LaLaurie Mansion story begins in 1831. Then, a man named Edward Dufessat sold his unfinished home at 1140 Royal Street to a well-off, pleasant-seeming couple, Dr. Leonard Louis Nicholas LaLaurie and his wife, Delphine. Delphine LaLaurie outwardly seemed like a pleasant socialite. The couple completed the 2-story mansion in the Federal architectural style. Situated on the corner of Royal and Hospital, now Governor Nichols Streets in the French Quarter, it seemed like a handsome addition to the neighborhood. Delphine started to abuse and torture her enslaved workers. Along with the rumors of the LaLaurie's unhappy marriage, news of Delphine's mistreatment of her slaves also began to circulate. In the early 1830s, rumors began to make their way through the French Quarter, alleging that Delphine and possibly her husband as well were mistreating their enslaved people. She had 12 of her slaves die in a 4-year span, with no cause of death mentioned for any of them. While it was common and legal for enslavers to physically discipline the men and women they owned, there were certain guidelines laid out to discourage excessive physical cruelty. Laws were in place to maintain a certain standard of upkeep for enslaved peoples, but on at least 2 occasions, court representatives went to the LaLaurie home with reminders. British social theorist Harriet Martineau was a contemporary of Delphine's and wrote in retrospect of Western travel in 1836 of Delphine's suspected hypocrisy. She related a tale in which a neighbor saw a small child flying across the yard towards the house, and Madame LaLaurie pursuing her, cowhide in hand, until they ended up on the roof. At that, Martineau said, she heard the fall and saw the child taken up, her body bending and limbs hanging as if every bone were broken. At night she saw the body brought out, a shallow hole dug by torchlight, and the body covered over. After this incident, an investigation took place, and charges of unusual cruelty leveled against Delphine. 9 enslaved people were removed from her home forfeit. However, Delphine managed to use her family's connections to get them all back to Royal Street. The extent of Delphine LaLaurie's cruelty remained just a rumor until April 1834. Despite their legal separation, both husband and wife were at the Royal Street mansion on that particular day. The fire at the LaLaurie home broke out on the morning of April 10, 1834. The blaze had originated in the kitchen, and the entire service wing was soon wrapped in flames. A crowd gathered to assist in fighting the fire. The volunteers were especially concerned about the LaLaurie's bondspeople, since it was known to the neighbors that the upper part of the building was used as a prison and that it was then tenanted by several unfortunate slaves. Among those who responded to the fire was Judge Jacques-François Canonge, who, in a polite manner, asked permission of the LaLauries to have the slaves removed to a place of safety. Louis LaLaurie, aware that discovery would be disastrous for him and his wife, rudely replied that there are those who would be better employed if they would attend to their own affairs instead of officiously intermeddling with the concerns of other people. The flames were gaining rapidly on the building, and Judge Canonge gave orders to break down the doors. They found a 70-year-old black woman chained to the stove. The cook told the fire marshal that she had set the fire in order to commit suicide because Delphine kept her chained up all day and punished her for the slightest infraction. In the attic above the kitchen, the first responders found a group of imprisoned enslaved people. The men who entered the service wing were greeted by an appalling sight as several wretched Negroes emerged from the fire, their bodies covered with scars and loaded with chains. Altogether, the rescuers discovered 7 slaves, more or less horribly mutilated. Some were suspended by the neck with their limbs stretched and torn from one extremity to the other. A woman was wearing an iron collar and chained with heavy irons by the feet. A man had a large hole in his head, his body covered from head to foot with scars and filled with worms. A mulatto boy declared that he had been chained for 5 months, being fed daily with only a handful of meal, and receiving every morning the most cruel treatment. The New Orleans Bee reported on April 11, 1834, the day after the fire. Upon entering one of the apartments, the most appalling spectacle met their eyes. 7 slaves, more or less horribly mutilated, were seen suspended by the neck, with their limbs apparently stretched and torn from one extremity to the other. These slaves were the property of the demon, in the shape of a woman. They had been confined by her for several months in the situation from which they had thus providentially been rescued, and had been merely kept in existence to prolong their suffering and to make them taste all that the most refined cruelty could inflict. It is commonly reported the horrors within included removed skin, broken bones set into peculiar positions, amputated limbs, exposed brain being stirred with a stick, and even someone unfortunate enough to have their lips sewn together trapping animal feces in their mouth. The rescued slaves were carried to the mayor's office at the Cabildo, where they were given medical treatment, food, and drink. A growing crowd around the LaLaurie mansion waited for the sheriff to come and arrest the guilty party. But all remained quiet within the house, and as the day passed and the officers of the law failed to appear, the people on the street grew increasingly angry. Suddenly, Madame Laurie's enslaved coachman, Baston, arrived with her carriage. She stepped in, and they flew at a gallop along the by-road to Lake Pontchartrain. The newspapers reported that her successful escape from the hands of justice so exasperated the populace that they attacked her empty house. The rioters smashed furniture, china, crystal, and works of art, wrecked the floors, stairs, and wainscoting, broke windows, dismantled the iron balconies, and continued their assault on the roof and walls until nearly the whole of the edifice had been pulled down.